Callum Reid had never been the kind of man who expected the world to be fair. He had learned that lesson the hard way, standing in a hospital corridor at 31 years old, holding his daughter's hand while the doctors told him that his wife, Karen, would not be coming home. That was 4 years ago. Since then, fair had become a word that belonged to other people's lives. What Callum had instead was a plumbing van with 200,000 kilometers on it, a small house on the edge of Stonebridge, Ontario, a 7-year-old girl named Addie who still slept with the stuffed rabbit her mother had given her, and a reputation built on one simple principle. If he said he would show up, he showed up. If he said the job would cost a certain amount, that was the amount on the invoice. No surprises, no upselling, no padding the bill because a customer looked like they could afford it. That reputation had kept the lights on for 4 years, and it was the only thing Callum cared about protecting. On a cold Tuesday morning in late February, when the kind of wind that only Lake Ontario could produce was cutting sideways across the parking lot of Meridian Tower, Callum arrived at 7:45 with his toolkit and his thermos. The call had come in the night before. A frozen pipe in one of the penthouse suites. Emergency rate, they had said. He would be compensated for the early start. Meridian Tower was the kind of building that made Callum feel like he had walked into a different city. 42 floors of glass and steel overlooking the waterfront, a lobby that smelled like expensive candles and heated marble floors, a concierge who looked at Callum's work jacket the way some people look at a stranger sitting in their usual seat. He signed in, took the service elevator, and found the unit. The pipe had burst behind the wall of the master bathroom, flooding into the vanity cabinet and beginning to creep toward the walk-in closet. Callum worked quickly and carefully. He shut the water, assessed the damage, cut into the drywall only where necessary, replaced the section of cop-up pipe that'd given out, and tested everything twice before he touched the cosmetic repair. 3 hours, start to finish. He cleaned up every trace of his work, repacked his tools, and filled out the invoice on his tablet. The total came to $340, parts, labor, and the emergency call-out fee. He knocked on the bedroom door and waited. The woman who opened it was wearing a cream blazer over a charcoal turtleneck, her dark hair pulled back into something precise, her eyes moving to the invoice on his tablet with a kind of practiced efficiency that suggested she read numbers for a living. Her name was Diane Ashworth. Callum did not know that yet. He would learn it later. She looked at the number. Then she looked at Callum. Then she looked at the number again, and something shifted in her expression. Not confusion exactly, more like amusement, the way someone smiles when a child says something they consider adorable. $340, she said. Yes, that includes the emergency. I know what it includes. She handed the tablet back without signing. I'm not paying this. Callum kept his face still. I'm sorry. It's a frozen pipe, she said. You were here for 3 hours. My assistant could have watched a YouTube video and done the same thing. With respect, Callum said, the pipe is behind a load-bearing section of wall. If the cut had gone 3 inches in the wrong direction, you'd be looking at structural damage claims and a lawsuit from the building. Diane Ashworth tilted her head slightly. Are you lecturing me? No, he said. I'm explaining. She picked up her phone and began typing, the conversation apparently over. Send the invoice to building management. They can sort it out. She stepped back and began to close the door. You can see yourself out through the service entrance. The door closed. Callum stood in the hallway for a moment. He had been doing this work for 12 years. He had dealt with difficult clients before, with people who disputed charges, with people who questioned his assessment, with people who were having bad days and took it out on whoever was closest. But something about the specific combination of her tone, the ease of it, the complete absence of any awareness that she was doing something wrong, settled in his chest in a way that was harder to shake than usual. He took the service elevator down. He drove to Addie's school, signed her out at lunch because he had promised her a soup at the diner on Morrison Street, and sat across from her while she told him about a project on beavers she was working on with her friend Yusuf. He smiled at the right moments and laughed at the part about the damn drawing that Yusuf had colored entirely in orange. But in the quieter part of his mind, the part that did not turn off even when he wanted it to, he kept returning to the hallway outside that penthouse. Not with anger, with something heavier than anger. He thought about Karen. He thought about how she used to say that people who diminish other people are always in some way frightened of something. He had never been entirely sure he believed it. But he had never entirely stopped thinking about it either. That night, after he put Addie to bed and sat down at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and the stack of invoices he needed to reconcile, he looked at the one from Meridian Tower for a long time. $340. 1 day of groceries, plus Addie's school field trip next month, plus the small amount he set aside each week toward a proper bed frame for her because she had been sleeping on a mattress on the floor since they moved and she had never once complained about it. He looked at the invoice and then he set it aside because looking at it longer would not change what had happened. What Callum did not know was that someone else had been in that hallway. A man named Arthur Pemberton had arrived at Meridian Tower at 7:30 that morning for what his assistant had described as a quiet site visit. Arthur had founded Pemberton Capital Partners 40 years ago in a rented office above a hardware store in Hamilton, Ontario, and had spent 4 decades building it into one of the most respected private investment firms in the country. He was 73, semi-retired in the way that people who have never actually learned to stop working are semi-retired, and he visited his building portfolio in person 3 or 4 times a year without announcing himself because, as he put it, announced visits told you nothing true about anything. He had been walking past the penthouse corridor when he heard the exchange through the door. Diane had left slightly ajar. He heard all of it. He heard Callum explain. He heard Diane's response. He heard the quiet that followed. What Arthur Pemberton noticed, standing in that corridor, was not the woman's rudeness. He had encountered that before in many forms, across many decades. What he noticed was the plumber. He noticed that the man said with respect and meant it. He noticed that there was no edge in the explanation, no performance of patience, just the actual thing. He noticed that when the door closed, the man did not say anything to himself, did not make a face, did not pull out his phone to post about it. He simply stood there for a moment and then walked toward the elevator with the same steadiness he had walked in with. Arthur Pemberton was a man who had spent his professional life trying to determine whether the people he trusted with resources would honor that trust. Not talent, not credentials, not the right kind of handshake at the right kind of event. Character. The actual article in the moments when nothing was being performed for anyone. He went back to his office and told his assistant, Margot, to find out who had done the emergency plumbing work at the tower that morning. It took Margot 4 hours. By that evening, Arthur knew that Callum Reid had been operating a solo plumbing business in Stonebridge for 7 years, that he had a daughter named Addie, that his wife had died of cancer 4 years ago, and that he had, in the past year alone, done pro bono work for 2 families on Linden Crescent who had lost income after a fire, reduced his rate for an elderly veteran on Queensway who called him every few months for small jobs, and once driven 40 minutes on a Sunday night because a single mother with a newborn had no hot water and no one else had answered their phone. Arthur knew all of this because Margot's was thorough, and because the people of Stonebridge talked about Callum Reid the way small towns talk about the people who hold things together quietly. Arthur stared at the report for a long time. He thought about 1987. He thought about a plumber named Gil Bertrand who had driven through a snowstorm to fix the heat in the rented bungalow where Arthur and his first wife had been living, who had refused to charge the full amount when he found out Arthur had just lost his job, and who had said, when Arthur tried to protest, "Everybody needs a hand at some point, son. Just make sure you remember it when it's your turn." Arthur had thought about Gil Bertrand more times than he could count in the decades since. He had tried to remember it was his turn in 100 different ways across 100 different situations. He told Margot to pull the files on the Stonebridge Community Housing Initiative he had been trying to staff for 2 years. The next day, Arthur called in 3 quiet favors. He had 2 associates drive through Stonebridge separately and ask around about Callum Reid without explaining why. He asked the owner of the diner on Morrison Street. He asked the principal of the school where Addie was in grade 2. He asked the property manager of the building on Linden Crescent. He asked a retired firefighter who organized the neighborhood watch on Callum Street. Every single answer came back the same way. Not in the same words, but with the same shape. Honest, shows up, doesn't make it about himself. Quietly helps people who wouldn't think to ask. One person said, "I've never heard anyone say a bad word about Callum Reid." Another said, "He's the kind of person you realize you were taking for granted only after he does something that surprises you." The firefighter on his street said, "That man raises that little girl right, and he does it without making a fuss about how hard it is." Arthur's associate, a younger man named James who had worked with him for 8 years, called from outside the diner and said, "Sir, I think you've found your person." Arthur said, "I already knew that." James said, "Then why did you send me?" Arthur said, "Because I wanted to be certain." That evening, Callum picked Addie up from her after-school program and stopped at the small grocery store on his way home to pick up the ingredients for the pasta she had been requesting for 3 weeks. She walked beside him through the store holding his hand and telling him that Yusuf had decided to add more orange to the beaver. and that she thought this was probably a mistake, but she was going to support him anyway because that's what friends do. Callum looked down at her and felt, as he often did in moments like this, something that he had no clean word for. Not happiness exactly, something older and quieter than happiness. The knowledge that the thing he was most responsible for in the world was so far turning out all right. He had no idea that at that exact moment, a man he had never met was signing a set of documents in a corner office in downtown Hamilton that would change the shape of everything. The next morning began the way mornings always began. Callum's alarm went off at 6:10. He made coffee, packed Addie's lunch, set out her clothes while she was still half asleep, made sure the rabbit was in her bag because she had a habit of leaving it in places and then missing it, and dropped her at school by 8:15. He had a job in the East End, a bathroom renovation consult, and he was pulling on his jacket in the parking lot when his phone rang from an unknown number. He almost didn't answer. He was glad he did. "Mr. Reid," said a woman's voice, calm and professional. "My name is Margot Chen. I'm calling on behalf of Arthur Pemberton. He'd like to meet with you today if possible, at your shop or wherever is convenient for you. He says he understands it's short notice, and he's happy to work around your schedule." Callum stood in the parking lot for a moment. "Arthur Pemberton," he said. "Yes, the Arthur Pemberton. He does tend to have that effect," Margot said, and there was something in her voice that suggested she was not entirely without a sense of humor. "He said to tell you it relates to the job you did at Meridian Tower yesterday, and that it's nothing to worry about." Callum said he could be at his shop by noon. He spent the morning not thinking about it, which was to say he spent the morning thinking about almost nothing else. He finished the consult, drove back to the shop, straightened up the small office at the back where he kept his files and a folding chair he used when he needed to think, and was organizing an invoice folder when a black SUV pulled up outside at 11:50. Arthur Pemberton was smaller in person than Callum expected, which he realized immediately made no sense because he had no particular expectation. The man had white hair, a gray wool coat, and eyes that moved the way a person's eyes move when they are accustomed to reading rooms quickly and accurately. He came in without ceremony, shook Callum's hand, said, "Callum, thank you for making time," and sat down in the folding chair as if he had sat in 1,000 rooms less comfortable than this and thought nothing of it. Callum leaned against the workbench. "I have to admit," he said, "I'm not sure what this is about." Arthur looked at him directly. "I was in the corridor at Meridian Tower yesterday morning." Callum was quiet. "I heard the conversation with Diane Ashworth," Arthur said. "I want to be clear that her behavior was not acceptable. She leases that unit from my company, and I've had a conversation with building management about what happened." "You didn't have to do that," Callum said. "I know," Arthur said. "I did it because it was right." He paused for a moment. "But that's not why I'm here." He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and removed an envelope. He set it on the workbench between them. "Before you open that," Arthur said, "I want to tell you something." Callum waited. "I've been trying to find someone for 2 years," Arthur said. "I have a project, a real one, not a press release, not a legacy gift with my name on a building. A community investment initiative focused on skilled trades training, affordable housing support, and emergency services for single-parent families across southern Ontario. I have the funding, the legal structure, and a board I trust. What I have not been able to find is the right person to run the operations side of it. Someone with practical knowledge of the trades, someone who understands what it actually means to need help and not know how to ask for it. Someone with the kind of judgment that doesn't come from a graduate program." He looked at Callum steadily. "I've spoken with a lot of people about you over the last 48 hours. Callum felt something shift in the air of the small room, the way pressure changes before weather. "Open the envelope," Arthur said. Callum picked it up. His hands did not feel entirely like his own hands as he opened it. Inside was a single folded document. He unfolded it. It took him several seconds to process what he was seeing. The number on the certified check was printed clearly. $16 million. He read it again. The number did not change. He set the document down on the workbench and looked at Arthur Pemberton and said absolutely nothing because there was nothing to say. "It's not a gift," Arthur said. "It's a working budget for the initiative, and I'm asking you to lead it." "You don't know me," Callum said. "I know enough," Arthur said. "I'm a plumber. You're someone who reduced your rate for a veteran on Queensway who you've never told anyone about," Arthur said. "You're someone who drove to Linden Crescent on a Sunday night for a woman with a newborn when no one else answered their phone. You're someone who, when a very powerful woman shut a door in your face over a $300 invoice, walked to the elevator with your head straight and your hands steady." He paused. "I've spent 40 years trying to figure out who deserves to be trusted with something real. I've been wrong before. I don't believe I'm wrong now. The shop was very quiet. Outside, a delivery truck went by on the street. Inside, Callum could hear his own breathing. He thought about the invoice pinned to the board above his desk. He thought about Addie's mattress on the floor. He thought about Karen, who used to say that the shape of a person's character shows up most clearly in the moments when they think no one is looking. I'd need to understand the full scope, Callum said finally. Of course, Arthur said, and I'd need to keep doing the work. Not this shop necessarily, but I can't take a role that takes me away from what I know. He looked at the check again and then looked away from it because looking at it for too long made it difficult to think clearly. The people who need this kind of help, they don't trust someone who shows up in a suit and doesn't know what a permit application looks like. Arthur Pemberton smiled for the first time since he had walked through the door. It was a real smile, the kind that moves the whole face. That, he said, is exactly why I chose you. The meeting lasted 2 hours. By the end of it, Callum understood the scope of what was being proposed, the timeline, the board structure, the reporting requirements, the flexibility Arthur was willing to build into the operational model. He asked careful questions. Arthur answered each one without impatience and without condescension, the way someone answers questions when they are genuinely interested in the response. When Arthur finally stood to leave, he extended his hand again. One more thing, he said, my daughter, Diane. Callum was quiet. She doesn't know I was there, Arthur said. She doesn't know any of this yet, but she will. He met Callum's eyes. I raised her better than she behaved yesterday. Somewhere along the way, she stopped noticing the people who make things work. I take some responsibility for that. He paused. She'll be hearing from me. Callum nodded once. After Arthur left, Callum sat in the folding chair for a long time. He did not call anyone. He did not post anything. He sat very still in the back of his small shop with the certified check on the workbench in front of him, and thought about Gil Bertrand driving through a snowstorm in 1987 and about the way some things move through the world quietly, from one hand to the next over decades, and only show their full shape when you are finally far enough away to see the whole line of them. 3 weeks later, Diane Ashworth arrived at the shop on a Wednesday afternoon without an assistant or a driver. She was wearing a navy coat, and she looked, Callum thought, like someone who had been thinking about something for a long time and had finally decided to stop thinking and do it instead. She carried a small envelope. She said, I owe you an apology, and I'd like to give you one if you'll hear it. Callum said, all right. She handed him the envelope. Inside was a check for $340, plus $200 more, and a handwritten note on plain white paper that said, I was rude and dismissive, and I knew what I was doing in the moment. I convinced myself it didn't matter. I was wrong, I'm sorry. There was no performance in it. No explanation of the pressures she'd been under, no softening context, no request for understanding. Just the plain admission in her own handwriting. Callum looked at the note for a moment. Everyone makes mistakes, he said. Not as a dismissal, as a fact. She nodded. Something moved across her face that he didn't try to name. She left without staying long, and Callum stood in the doorway of the shop watching her walk back to her car. He thought about his father, who had been an electrician in Sudbury, who had said once that the measure of a person was not what they did when things were going well, but what they did when things were going badly, and nobody would have blamed them for going badly themselves. He had not thought about that in years. He went back inside and pinned the invoice to the board above his desk, paid this time, and sat down at his desk to answer his emails. 6 months after that, the Pemberton Community Initiative opened its offices in a converted industrial space in East Hamilton. The building had been chosen deliberately, Arthur had explained, because it was in the same neighborhood where he had started his first company 40 years ago, and because geography, like character, carried memory. On the day of the opening, Callum stood at the front of a room full of people he had not known a year before and felt entirely out of place in a way that also felt, somehow, exactly right. Beside him, holding his hand, was Addie, who had dressed herself that morning and chosen the blue cardigan he had bought her for her last birthday, and the rabbit tucked into his jacket pocket as her contribution to the day. The initiative launched vocational skills programs for young people who had aged out of the foster system. It provided emergency trades services at no cost for single-parent households below a certain income threshold. It funded transitional housing support, and it ran a mentorship program that connected working tradespeople with high school students who might not otherwise imagine that kind of work as a real option. In the first year, it served 1,100 families across southern Ontario. Callum Reid that number in a quarterly report late one evening while Addie was asleep, and he sat with it for a while before he turned off the light. He thought about the hallway at Meridian Tower. He thought about the moment the door had closed and he had stood there, quietly, with his toolkit and his thermos, and $340 that no one intended to pay him. He thought about how the story had seemed in that moment to be simply about unfairness, about what it felt like to do good work and be told it didn't matter. He understood now that the story had never been about that at all. It had been about what a person chooses to carry forward. Not the grievance, not the bitterness, not the wound, the steadiness. The refusal to let one person's smallness become permission to become smaller yourself. Karen would have had a cleaner way to say it. She always did. He turned off the light and went to check on Addie, who was asleep on her actual bed frame, the one he had finally bought in March, with the rabbit tucked under one arm and her project on beavers sitting on the desk beside her. He stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he went to bed and the house was quiet, and outside the Stonebridge night carried on the way it always did, steady and unhurried and without any awareness of how much had changed inside that small house on the edge of town.